Health Perspectives with Caylah McCoy.
Welcome to Health Perspective. My name is Caylah McCoy, and we are home of the Montreal Alouettes and the Montreal Canadiens, as well as the Just for Laughs Comedy Festival. Our goal on Health Perspective is to educate and enlighten people to live healthier lifestyles. I'm a registered nurse by trade, Canadian and American Nursing Board certified, and we bring you the most up-to-date information on health perspectives, whatever's going on that's actually in the news. We will go to our to very reputable sites and our network of experts to get the latest information. And so what we're going to be speaking on in the next couple of weeks, and as it gets closer to being brought to Canada, is the Shingrix, which is the new herpes zoster vaccine, which is something that I will get into later on, as opposed to the injection that's given by Merck, and the difference between the two. So should you go and get the herpes zoster, which is otherwise known as shingles vaccine, now that you can have available at your pharmacy through Merck Frost, which is the pharmaceutical company that produces it, or should you wait for the GlaxoSmithKline vaccine that's coming out in 2018? And we don't work for pharmaceutical companies, but it's very interesting when there is a new vaccine that the CDC, the Center for Disease Control in the United States, is suggesting that if you've received the Merck vaccine, that you become re-vaccinated with Shingrix, and they're a nonprofit organization run by the government, so they have no ties in pharmaceuticals as well. And so there you have it. So on the show today, we have a jam-packed show, and one of the questions that people have asked, obviously you're buying new homes, you're investing in property, you have maybe a tenant or yourself where you thought to yourself, what on earth is that smell? So not everyone can remove mold safely and effectively, just as not everyone can operate an infrared camera. These tasks require experience and skill. So all molds should be investigated, especially if you feel that mold, musty smell. You want to make sure that you either hire an expert thermographer, or maybe you've got some water damage as well, and that you have somebody that comes in and does a home inspection just to make sure that you and yourself, your loved ones, and your tenants are safe. So the ducts should be cleaned before the furnace is turned on, as ducts of the home is like lungs of your body. So there was a really interesting study that came out where one of my friends was looking for a home, and there was just a really toxic mold, and I went with them to look for the home, and it was just very pungent, and the real estate agent had said it was coming from the carpet, and as we got closer towards the basement, it was actually coming from the basement, so we knew it wasn't just the carpet, there was a deeper problem. So a Colorado doctor by the name of Jill Carnaha, in her article, is toxic mold exposure, and is that what's causing your symptoms? And so some of the symptoms that Dr. Carnahan describes as fatigue and weakness, headache, light sensitivity, poor memory, difficult word finding that can even mimic a type of dementia or Alzheimer's, especially if you have an elderly parent who's exhibiting these symptoms. Difficulty concentration, morning stiffness, joint pain, unusual skin sensation, tingling, numbness, shortness of breath, sinus congestion, chronic cough, appetite swings, body temperature regulation, which is a little off, increased urinary frequency or increased thirst, red eyes, blurred vision, sweats, mood swings, sharp pains, abdominal pain, diarrhea, bloating, tearing, disorientation, metallic taste in the mouth, static shock. So in other words, when you go from lying down to standing up, all of a sudden you might see stars or dark until your blood pressure readjusts itself. So it can take a toll on your circulatory system and your nervous system. Vertigo, feeling lightheadedness. So on the phone, we have expert Charles Leduc, who's the operation manager at Mold Buster, the mold removal experts in Montreal. Welcome to the show, Charles.
Thank you, Caylah. How are you today?
I'm good. So can you explain to us what the different types of molds are? Because obviously as a nurse, I know that when you go to a fridge and you open up the fridge and get a whiff of what we call penicillin, that's not a bad mold because we have mold everywhere on the planet. But there is that one toxic mold that's highly dangerous to yourself and your loved ones if you're living with it.
Well, in fact, to answer that question, there are thousands of different species of mold. And it's important to know that all molds are considered to be allergenic, which means that all molds can carry the potential for creating some discomfort in people. Now, in terms of the toxigenic strains of mold, there are a number of them. So we typically hear about Stachybotrys chartarum, which is the black mold, the toxic black mold that people tend to focus on a lot, and that was actually brought up in Aaron Brockovich, which made that a little famous. But in fact, there are a number of different toxigenic species of mold, including Chaetomium, Fusarium, and some forms of Aspergillus and Penicillium, which are also known to be toxigenic. So it's not so black and white, unfortunately.
So to our laymen that are listening out there, obviously, if you're looking at like the black mold and the one that I heard you say that's related to penicillin, that's more of a greenish color. But the dark mold, what we thought was the toxic mold, is almost like a black, oily, and it's like a slimy feel when you touch it, right?
Well, here's the thing, Caylah, is that not all dark discolorations are fungal in nature, meaning they're not all mold, and not all mold that is black in color is actually the black mold known as Stachybotrys. So, in fact, Stachybotrys, which is the species of toxigenic mold that we focus on, can be a number of different colors. It could be gray, green, white, and black. It all depends on the material, the organic-based material which it's adhered to or living off of, and depends on a number of different indoor environmental factors. So it's important to know that the color of what we could visibly see is not always a reflection of the species.
So what produces that smell, that musty smell? That normally you'll find in church basements.
In church basements, well, in almost every basement that we inspect, we encounter a smell that people identify as being musty or moldy. Now, that smell, for some people, will be how they interpret mold as smelling. And for us as trained inspectors at Mold Busters, that odor could be a variety of things. So what causes that smell is moisture content, humidity levels, a lack of adequate ventilation. Mold in itself produces what's called an MVOC, essentially an off gas produced by the spores. Once that off gas comes into your ambient indoor environment and collides with existing airborne bacteria, that collision of particles creates its own independent odor. Now, another thing is that often clients will misidentify an odor. They will identify what they think is mold in their environment. But when we come in to do an inspection, we could determine that it's maybe septic related or even related to a mice infestation. So every case needs to be individually assessed, and every case needs to be individually identified by a trained professional.
And I think bats can give off that like a pungent smell because of the urine and the excrements of the bat.
Oh, of course. Any type of animal byproduct, especially mice urine and fecal deposits will emit a very strong and acrid odor that's often misidentified as being moldy because it comes on suddenly. It's hidden. We don't necessarily see it, but it's all stuck within the insulation behind our walls. Now, fortunately, we don't have the hantavirus necessarily up here in Canada where we are in Montreal. But the mice in particular, when they urinate, they will urinate within the insulation, which is all cellulose. And once cellulose becomes saturated with a moisture content, the possibility of mold to develop is very high. So these are all things that we need to factor in.
Okay, and as well as, if I could just throw that in, bed bugs. They can give off like a musty smell as well.
Well, bed bugs are an entirely separate endeavor. But yes, all of these things, and I think it's important, the general message is that as Canadians, we spend almost 90%.
Are you still there?
Oh, yes, I'm still here.
We're going to continue without you.
The line just kind of cut out.
That's fine.
Oh.
So we were talking about
so
the smell of bed bugs. That can give off like a musty odor as well. And so that's why it's important to have an expert like yourself to come in and your company just to verify what it is that you're actually dealing with, because it's not mold until it's tested.
Well, that's right. And, as Canadians, we spend over 90% of our time indoors, whether that's in our office or in our home. And everything within an indoor environment is synergistic. It will work within each other and will also be factors that will influence a change. So anything from bed bugs to other rodents to moisture to humidity to lack of airflow to even the way that the belongings within their home are placed, that will all carry the potential for affecting the indoor environment in a negative way.
So obviously, one of the things you come in and you start testing, or do you just look around and say all you need is a dehumidifier, or do you have to do some testing?
Well, every one of our inspections is a diagnostic inspection. So our trained technicians come into your home. They would start off with a comprehensive visual and diagnostic assessment. So by visually looking at the environment and by diagnostically assessing the state. So we measure humidity levels. We will use an infrared camera to detect hidden anomalies or heat differentials. We will check for moisture. We will do what's called an indoor air particle count, meaning we will count the amount of solid airborne particulates within the home. And we will do a variety of other scans to assess the current state of your indoor environment. And in some cases, we may recommend doing additional forms of testing, like air quality testing or sampling of physical materials. Again, each case is individual, and each case needs to be assessed individually.
So on that note, what we're going to do is, before we go to break, because we have about 2 minutes, I'm going to ask you about, and we might have to go to break and then you can continue, because I'm going to ask you the loaded question, what about mold in the furnace? And obviously before you start turning on an air conditioner or or heaters where you've got ventilation, and how often do you have to have your furnace or your ventilation cleaned out, swept out?
Okay, well, when it comes to a furnace, it's important to know that mold requires an organic-based material to live off of. It needs something that's high in cellulose. So ductwork is inorganic. So sheet metal is not an organic material, which means that if mold is present or has the potential for being present within your ductwork, it will be within organic-based materials that are floating around inside. The biggest culprit is dust. Dust is the most susceptible and weakest organic-based material where mold can live and thrive off of. So that's where duct cleaning is actually quite crucial in minimizing and removing the dust, which is a food source for potential mold to grow. But if mold can grow in your ductwork, it may be reflective of a bigger issue, maybe related to humidity or a epicenter of contamination, meaning that there's already a contamination of mold present and that those spores are traveling into your ductwork, adhering itself to dust, and then propagating further.
So on that note, what we're going to do is we're going to go to break, and we'll be right back. And so to dust or not to dust your furnace, just hang on. We'll be right back.
CJRS 1650 AM, Montreal. Health Perspectives with Caylah McCoy.
the second half of Health Perspectives. We're into the home stretch, and we're talking with Charles Leduc, who's the operations manager at Mold Busters, the mold removal experts in the Montreal area. Welcome back to the show, Charles.
Thank you, Caylah.
So prior to going to break, to dust or not to dust the furnace, and you were talking about how dust can be a food source for molds. And if you can just go into that a little bit more, that would be great, because I think we all have, a lot of people that are listening have that problem, or might have that problem, or don't know that, they should be dusting the furnace.
Yeah, absolutely. So duct cleaning is something that we recommend should happen, every 5 or 10 years. Now, the frequency in which your ducts get cleaned depend on a variety of different factors. So if you have animals, then that may increase the frequency in which you need to clean your ducts. If you have renovation work or do construction within your home, that will create an additional amount of dust, which may require you to clean your ducts faster than that 5 or 10 year period. But at the end of the day, the best tip and tool that we recommend to our clients is to know their own bodies. So as we said earlier, as Canadians, we spend almost 90% of our time indoors. So we get to know our body very well, and we get to pick up on sudden slight changes in how we feel. And it's important to keep in mind that perhaps the air that we're breathing in could be reflective of how we're feeling.
And to some of our listeners that are listening, that have parents that are living at a distance, and you hear about, some of the aches and pains, or mom or dad, they're losing, their memory. Just make sure that there is not an underlying problem of mold in the house that's been unaddressed, that are leading to these symptoms that, might mimic getting older, or that might mimic Alzheimer's or respiratory problems, that there's not. That's one of the things that you want to do, is have a home inspection. And so one of the things that you do, so lead us through, you come into a house, let's say there's a house that has a lot of mold. How, what are the cultures that are taken, and how long does it take before people can get results and start treating?
Well, there are a number of different types of testing that can be performed within an indoor space. First of all, it all depends on what the client actually wants to know. So in some cases, clients don't want to know the type of mold that they have. They just want it out of their place, and they want to find what the source or sources are and how to correct it. So if that's the case, then obviously our procedure for moving forward will be quite different than if a client wants to know the species of mold in which they're breathing in. And there are a number of different ways to do that. The most common, the most cost-effective, and the fastest in terms of a turnaround time for results is what we call non-viable air quality testing, or spore traps. And what this is a machine that is calibrated to capture a specific amount of liters of air within a sampling medium called a cassette. And this absorbs solid particulates like spores onto an adhesive-coated glass slide. Once those particles are collected onto the sampling medium, they are sent to an independent laboratory for microbial analysis, where they will be able to identify the spores found and the concentration up to the cubic meter. So this is the most common and most reliable in terms of getting a snapshot of what species are present within your home. Now, the average turnaround time for results with our company is between 1 to 3 business days, which is quite fast. Now, there are other forms of air quality testing which do take a little bit longer, but carry a more specific analysis. So specifically, that's what we would call a viable air quality assessment. And a viable air quality assessment is very similar to a spore trap, except the sampling medium is a petri dish or an agar. And essentially the particles or spores that are absorbed into this particular dish need to be cultured, which does mean that it takes up to 2 weeks for the spores to fully culture and for the laboratory to be able to speciate them. Again, it all depends on what kind of information you want and how fast you want it. There are many options to choose from.
Now, once all of that is diagnosed and let's say the work is done and the mold's been treated, you can still end up, or let's say it's a mold that can't be treated where, for example, it's just and I had this situation years ago where it was just a dehumidifier that was required because of the fact that the home had been soaking in all this water that had not water, the humidity that had not been treated and that left a musty smell. I guess one of the things to do is to get rid of the carpet that was in that environment and to start fresh.
Well, exactly. So every case that has a mold or a potential mold problem, like we said earlier, needs to be individually assessed. And what our company strives to do is it's kind of a weird business model when you think of it, because if we do our job properly, we will never see the client again. We don't strive for recurring business, right? So what we want to do is be able to come in, accurately assess what the current problems are, what are the potential sources of this issue, and then to issue a comprehensive plan of action that addresses all of the above. And so in some cases, the mold or the indoor environmental concerns may be related to belongings, such as, your old carpet, or it could be related to a lack of ventilation or humidity control. It could be related to these water infiltrations that are coming in based on improper moisture diversion or foundation problems. So all of these individual circumstances are looked at and identified in our plan of actions.
So what's the difference between mold and mildew?
Well, to keep it really simple, the difference is that mold is a living organism that will reproduce on its own and propagate, meaning spread, and that mold can carry the potential for mycotoxins, whereas mildew is not a living organism. It does not grow on its own, it does not reproduce, and it is typically non-toxic in nature. They're both very similar in appearance. They're both caused essentially by moisture, and we use them synonymously. We say mold and mildew as though they're the same thing, but they're both fundamentally different.
Right. The mold that we see, we can have mildew on the outside, if you on the trees and the forest, etc. And then when you see the mushrooms are a type of fungus, and so that's a mold that's growing out in nature. And so,
well, exactly. And Caylah, you make a really good point. Is that first of all, fungus makes up for 25% of the Earth's biomass. It is ubiquitous. Mold is ubiquitous. It is normal for us to have mold in our outdoor and indoor environment. And this is one of the things that at Mold Busters, we really try to drive this point through to our clients, is that we're not here to try and scare people into believing they have a mold problem that's going to kill them, because that may not be the case. The molds that are found within your indoor environment could very well be normal, ubiquitous spore types. We need to be able to determine if they are normal, if they're found in normal concentrations, and if they're inside an environment, is there a way to dilute them so that their effects could be mitigated?
Because as a hiker, just even going through parts of the wood where there's not a lot, let's say it's always damp, areas that are always damp, always wet, where there's not a lot of sunlight will smell like mold just walking through it.
Well, absolutely. It's very normal. So if it wasn't for mold, a lot of our organisms wouldn't be able to live. I mean, we eat mushrooms every day, and mushroom is a type of fungus. So we need to be respectful of the fact that there is a process that does not involve us as humans. But what we do have in terms of a responsibility is to control how these organisms take root within our indoor spaces, now, and if they can be controlled.
Are you able to talk about air quality? Is that an area that you can chime in on and discuss with us?
Well, air quality is a very broad term, but if it's more specifically related to indoor environmental concerns, absolutely.
Yeah, if you can talk to us a little bit, do these air purifiers work? The more expensive ones, are they more beneficial than the ones that are lower in quality?
Well, when it comes to air quality and air purification, for the last 15 years or so, Mold Busters has assessed a number of indoor environments, residential, commercial, government, etc. And over the years, we've grown to see a lot of patterns. And the one thing that we could tell about air quality as it relates to purification is that purification doesn't really work. So think of it like this. You could have a big pile of elephant dung resting in your living room, and you could use a purifier to remove the odor that's caused by the dung. But at the end of the day, if you don't remove that big pile in your living room, you still have a big pile in your living room. So purification works in a similar process. It helps to mitigate some of the potential issues, but it doesn't resolve them. So if you're okay with putting a Band-Aid on a severed artery, then an air purification system is likely for you.
Okay, now what about after people have had their mold treated, the carpets ripped up, everything? Does that improve somebody's quality of life?
Well, absolutely. So one of the things that we're big advocates of is the removal of retentive materials. So carpets are like sponges. No matter how clean they are, they will retain particles. A lot of these could be normal: dust, pollen, even mold spores from the outside. These are generally normal. But because we spend 90% of our time indoors, and because these particles then become dislodged from the fibers of the carpet and then into the ambient space and then into our respiratory system, problems can arise from that. So in terms of controlling an environment, of course, removing any compromised materials or retentive materials is a big plus. And the second one that we're big fans of is to introduce a proper exchange of air. So air going out and air coming in.
And is there anything that people can buy to measure, the good air versus the one that they want to, like when it becomes to a point, like when you measure E. coli in water in like for example, the St. Lawrence River, is there any way of measuring good air versus when you need to do something about it, where a little alarm system might go off?
Yeah. What we usually recommend is to first maybe get your home before going out and going to Home Depot or on Amazon and picking up these home monitoring kits, which may not be accurate representations of your indoor environment. What we recommend first is get your home professionally assessed, get a comprehensive air quality assessment, get a thorough inspection, get to know where things are actually at, and then afterwards, if it's with our company, we'll help you devise a plan on how to monitor which products or systems or technologies would be good based on your home. Because again, a home is just like a person. They're all snowflakes. They're all individual. They all have their own unique quirks. They're all designed a certain way and have their own propensities. So we need to be able to recommend a solution that's specific to that home.
Great. So if you want to keep yourself safe, your family safe, you can contact Charles at Mold Busters, the mold removal experts in Montreal. Contact the company. Can you give us your website, Charles?
Yeah, so it's www.bustmold.com, BUSTMOLD.com. Just Google Mold Busters Montreal. We pop up everywhere.
Okay, and can you give us the phone number as well?
Absolutely. It's 514-667-3696.
Well, thank you so much for being on the show. It was a real pleasure just to have you on and just to explain to us what I feel like I'm wiser as a result of this conversation.
Well, that's terrific. Thanks a lot, Caylah, for having us on, and we hope to do it sometime again.
Well, for sure. You're on my list. So for all the listeners that have tuned in, thank you so much for tuning in and helping to keep Health Perspectives on the air. And big thanks to Andre Jolie, who's our master control technician here. And I want to wish everybody a safe drive home. God bless.